nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, two great guests for you. Former US Defence Secretary Leon Panetta on the new defence agreement with Australia and the UK and the threat of war with China.
We're also going to hear from the former head of the Food and Drug Administration on COVID boosters, vaccine mandates and more.
Plus, a new Trump book reveals just how dicey things got towards the end there.
And Biden's Afghan headaches are not going away. But first...
70 years after the signing of the ANZUS Treaty, 20 years after it was invoked for the first and only time after the 9/11 attacks on America, this week the alliance took a step into an uncertain future.
Our world is becoming more complex, especially here in our region, the Indo-Pacific. This affects us all. The future of the Indo-Pacific will impact all our futures. To meet these challenges, to help deliver the security and stability our region needs, we must now take our partnership to a new level.
And that new level relationship is so modern, it's a throuple with the United Kingdom, a trilateral security partnership clearly aimed at trying to keep China in check. And its name?
AUKUS.
Sorry, what's that again?
AUKUS.
AUKUS?
AUKUS. It sounds strange, there's all these acronyms, but it's a good one.
If you say so, Mr. President. But what will AUKUS do?
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia. Over the next 18 months, we will work together to seek to determine the best way forward to achieve this.
As a result, Australia is tearing up its $90 billion deal to build 12 French-designed diesel-powered subs. The French are not too impressed, saying they can simply observe and regret the development. Australia will join the US, the UK, Russia, China and India as the only nations with nuclear-powered submarines, which have longer ranges, go faster and do so more quietly. China's submarine fleet is growing fast and may soon exceed that of the United States. But President Biden was at pains this week to point out Australia was not joining the nuclear weapons club.
I want to be exceedingly clear about this. We're not talking about nuclear-armed submarines. These are conventionally armed submarines that are powered by nuclear reactors. This technology is proven, it's safe.
For more, we're joined by Leon Panetta, who served as United States Defence Secretary in the Obama administration. He's also a former director of the CIA and White House Chief of Staff under Bill Clinton. Mr. Secretary, welcome to Planet America.
Good to be with you.
So why do you think this announcement about AUKUS began with a big announcement about Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines rather than just an announcement of a memorandum of understanding or a summit to be held someday? What are they saying in that?
Well, I think it was important to show that there was some substance to the security partnership that was being announced. And there's no question that building on the bond between the United States and Australia and improving our way of addressing strategic interests, also trying to make sure that we abide by international rules, but more importantly, that we work together to promote peace and stability in that region. I think all of that sends a very important message to China and to others that we're going to do everything necessary, not only to protect our interests, but to advance our goals in that region. And the best way to do that is obviously by helping Australia develop that capability so that they too can participate in providing the kind of security that all of us are interested in doing in that region.
And Mr. Secretary, what else do you expect to come from AUKUS? And does this, do you think, represent any kind of a shift in American foreign policy?
I think it sends a very important message to China that the United States is in fact going to rely on our allies in addressing the issues that we're concerned about when it comes to the Pacific. And there's one thing that China does not like, and that has a hard time doing, frankly, is working with allies. And I've always felt when I was involved in that region, that the more we could stress alliances with Australia, with South Korea, with Japan, with other countries in the Southeast Asia region, that those alliances, if they bind together, not only with regards to security, but with regards to trade and other interests in that region, that is the most important step we can take in saying to China, if you don't abide by international rules, it isn't just the United States, it is the region that will respond against you.
So how do you expect China to react to this development?
I think China is not going to like it. They're not going to like, obviously, the fact that we're providing the potential of Australia having nuclear-powered submarines in the region. I'm sure that particularly is going to aggravate them. But I also think that indicating that we have a new security relationship between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, again, is going to provide additional aggravation for them in that region. You know, for the last few years, they pretty much had their way in the Pacific. They've generally did not feel that the United States was going to exert any kind of leadership when it came to our allies, and they were right. During the Trump administration, the basic approach was America first and largely abandoning a lot of our alliances. I think the Biden administration recognizes that if we are to provide world leadership, we absolutely have to do this by working with our allies. And this security partnership that was announced is a reflection of that kind of alliance.
Now, a few nuclear submarines wouldn't make a massive difference in a conflict with China, I would have thought, but could this actually exacerbate tensions with China?
You know, I can remember when the United States was talking about rebalancing to the Pacific. I went to China and sat down with President Xi. And the first thing he objected to was the fact that we were going to rebalance our forces to the Pacific. And my response to him was, look, the United States is a Pacific power. We have interests in the Pacific just as you have interests in the Pacific. And we have issues, frankly, that we can work together on, whether it's trade, whether it's security, and other areas. Our goal should be to advance the peace and prosperity of the region together. And if we can do that, then we'll all move in the same direction. But don't assume that just because China is a country on the Pacific, that somehow it can control the Pacific. It can't. We are all partners in dealing with issues in the Pacific region, and we should be. So I think President Xi recognized that argument, and I think China will recognize that argument as well, whether it comes from Australia, the United States, or the United Kingdom.
And Leon Panetta, what is your expectation? Do you think that the United States will be encouraging or indeed pressuring more allies like Australia to upgrade their military capabilities now?
I think that's an important step to take. I really do. I thought it was important for the ASEAN countries to basically come together with regards to our security in order to make sure that we were protecting our common interests. And rather than just being, a group of nations that, talk about different issues, when you build a security alliance, when you build up the security capabilities of those countries, that represents real strength in terms of dealing with China or anybody else for that matter. So I really do think that as long as these countries are developing their security capabilities, as long as they're developing the approach that they need to protect their national security, I think we can really build a very strong alliance in the Pacific that makes clear that all of us are going to abide by international rules and we expect China to abide by those rules as well.
Secretary, why do you think Australia and America have grown so close over the last few decades? It seems like Australia has leapfrogged a number of alliances that America had to almost have most favoured nation status now, along with probably the UK. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm glad to see that because I've always had a very special place in my heart for Australia. I think Australia is a great ally. We share very common interests. We believe in the same values that are important to democracies. And I think that our ability to be able to develop a closer relationship with Australia, particularly in the Pacific region, means that we can provide the kind of security, protect our strategic interests, advance our trade interests, advance our economies by working closely together. I think this provides a great deal of hope, not only for the interests of the United States and Australia, but very frankly, for the interests of peace and prosperity in the Pacific region. And that's what we should all be interested in doing.
Secretary Panetta, let me put you on the spot with a big picture question. Is it your anticipation that the United States will go to war with China at some point in this century?
You know, I get asked that question quite a bit these days. And my view is that China is not interested in a war, and neither is the United States, or anybody else for that matter, interested in a conflict in that region. But to avoid a conflict means that we are going to have to work together. We're going to have to continue to have dialogue, and we're going to have to continue to build up our security in that region in order to send a signal that no country is going to be able to implement its will militarily without facing the combined force of all of the countries in Southeast Asia, including Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. That's a very important message to send to China at this point in time.
Secretary Leon Panetta, many thanks indeed for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you very much for having me.
Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was copping a little bit of hostile and friendly fire on Capitol Hill this week, facing criticism from across the aisle for the Biden administration's handling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Mr. Secretary, the execution of the U.S. withdrawal was clearly and fatally flawed.
President Biden has described the evacuation from Afghanistan as an extraordinary success. This has to be the lie of the 21st century.
Now, Blinken maintained that Biden was bound to a timeline for withdrawal agreed to by his predecessor, Donald Trump. But Senator Mitt Romney, Republican of Utah, was not having a bar of that.
You didn't inherit the date. The date was May 1st, and you pushed it to August 31st. Why didn't you push it much later?
We took some risk in terms of what the Taliban would do or not do after May 1st.
It's a risk with other people we took.
It's a risk.
The risk was on people we care for.
Being told off by Mitt Romney, it's like being told off by your dad. It wasn't pretty, Chaz. Biden's problems over the withdrawal from Afghanistan don't end there either.
Look, they don't. Blinken might have a decent answer about how many American citizens still haven't escaped Afghanistan.
What is the number of Americans who are in Afghanistan as of the last update you received?
The Congressman, going back to this weekend, we had about 100 American citizens in contact with us who seek to leave Afghanistan.
But he's always been more vague about the number of American long-term residents, the green card holders, who are stuck in Afghanistan. And this week, we found out why.
Okay, how many green card holders?
Green card holders is something that we don't track directly. So what we've done is we've solicited people, if they are green card holders, to let us know. I think the best estimates are that there's several thousand green card holders in Afghanistan.
Several thousand is a lot of people. But the biggest problem is this. You might recall the drone strike just before America left Afghanistan, where they took out an ISIS terrorist who supposedly was just about to fire at the airport. Well, turns out that might not be the full story. Not even close, actually. The New York Times identified the guy that America killed. He was Zamari Ahmadi, a long-time worker for a US aid group. Now, you might think he could have been an undercover terrorist. Well, then he was playing the long game, because he worked as an electrical engineer for this American aid group for 15 years. The military had said they thought he loaded explosives into his car, but the New York Times analysed actual video feeds to find that he only seemed to be loading water canisters into his trunk for his family. The military had said they'd observed secondary explosions from his car when it was hit, which suggested that there must have been explosives in there in the first place. But the New York Times analysed the site of the attack and found no evidence of a second explosion at all. The military said they had intercepted communications with an alleged ISIS safe house, and that was why he was making all these suspicious stops with his car. The New York Times spoke to the people who drove with him in that car, and they said it was simply a normal day at work. And finally, the military said they killed 3 people. The New York Times says they killed 10. We still don't know the truth for sure, John, but the New York Times have definitely done the legwork on this one. And so far, not looking good for the Biden administration.
Yeah, who say the problem is we can't really investigate this because we've got nobody left in Afghanistan to do it. Maybe they could put the green card holders to work on that one as well. But now it's time for a whole new segment on Planet America, which we're going to call... Oh, so now you tell us. And with a heap of new books about the dying days of the Trump presidency hitting bookshops now, we're discovering just how close we all came to actually dying in those dying days. Iconic Watergate reporter Bob Woodward has teamed up with fellow Washington Poster Robert Costa to write the book Peril, which reveals the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark McLennan, felt the need to reach out to his Chinese counterpart twice to reassure him Trump wasn't about to start a war. Woodward and Costa write that one call took place on October 30, 2020, 4 days before the election, the second on January 8, 2021, just 2 days after the Capitol siege. The US had intelligence that the Chinese thought an American attack was imminent, based on tensions over military exercises in the South China Sea, deepened by Trump's belligerent rhetoric towards China. Not only that, the authors claim that General Milley believed the president had suffered a mental decline after the election, and in a call that Milley made to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, he agreed with her evaluation that Trump was, quote, unstable. Former President Trump denies he ever contemplated launching a military strike against China and has described General Milley's comments as treason. Here he is speaking to his former press secretary Sean Spicer on his TV show on Newsmax.
So first of all, if it is actually true, which is hard to believe, that he would have called China and done these things and was willing to advise them of an attack or in advance of an attack, that's treason. And I would think, I've had so many calls today saying, that's treason.
You know, I got to say, John, I've spent years rolling my eyes at Trump calling everything he doesn't like treason, but in this case, he could potentially be correct.
Really?
Really? Let's dive into that story for a second. According to CNN's take on the book, Milley went so far as to pledge that he would alert his Chinese counterpart in the event of an attack, saying, quote, General Lee, you and I have known each other for 5 years. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise. So he's saying in that quote that he would warn China before America attacked them. Now, let's remind ourselves of the constitutional definition of the word treason. Treason is when you either levy war against America or you give aid and comfort to America's enemies. And America's enemies is defined as countries America is at war with. So, isn't warning another country, America's about to attack you in an act of war, kind of the literal definition of treason? Now, you might think trying to avoid a war, that's a good idea, and fair enough. It could be a noble thing to do. I'm not having a go. But the military is not supposed to go behind the defense secretary or the president's back. If you don't believe me, ask Alexander Vindman. Do you remember him? He was the person who tried to get Trump impeached when he overheard Trump pressuring the Ukrainian president on a phone call. He is no friend of Trump's, but he is a stickler for process, and so he tweeted, "If this is true, General Milley must resign. He usurped civilian authority, broke chain of command, and violated the sacrosanct principle of civilian control over the military. It's an extremely dangerous precedent." By the way, there's more, because CNN also quoted Woodward's book as saying that Milley called a secret meeting in his Pentagon office to review the process for military action, including launching nuclear weapons. He supposedly told senior military officials to not take orders from anyone unless he personally was involved. Here's the quote: "No matter what you were told, you do the procedure. You do the process, and I'm part of that procedure," he supposedly said. And then he made each of them specifically agree and regard that as an oath. Once again, you might think that's all a relief to hear, but Milley's job is only to advise the president. He does not have the legal authority to impede or override the president's military orders. However, there's one big disclaimer here. If it's true, there's a lot of interpretation from Woodward going on in all those little bits I read out, and defence is already disputing these claims. They say Milley actually just tried to remind uniformed leaders of long-established and robust procedures, one of which is for Milley to communicate orders from the president. So that kind of checks out. They also say that it was actually Defence Secretary Mark Esper who was first worried about China misreading America's signals, and he directed his office to back-channel a message to the Chinese to reassure them that America was not looking for a war. Their message? "We won't attack you, let's keep communicating with each other," kinda like the message Milley supposedly delivered. One source said Milley was absolutely not going rogue. Esper took the initiative on this in October. Milley's message followed Esper's. They also said all calls were staffed, coordinated and communicated with the Department of Defense and the interagency. Now, John, if that is all true, what I just read out, that means there will be about 10 to 15 witnesses on every call, plus a transcript somewhere. So we're going to find out soon enough what's true and what's not. In the meantime, much more importantly, there's more juicy gossip I hear.
Yes, there is, Chaz. Woodward and Costa also report that former Vice President Mike Pence, who has been praised for resisting pressure from Trump not to certify the results of last year's election, in fact, asked confidence if there were ways that he could accede to Trump's demands. That Pence called Dan Quayle, another former VP, asking if there were any grounds to pause the certification because of ongoing legal challenges. Dan Quayle reportedly told Pence there was, quote, "none, zero, forget it, put it away." When Pence informed Trump there was nothing he could do to stop the certification, Trump reportedly replied,
"I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this."
Accusing Pence of betrayal, Trump said,
"I made you. You were nothing."
It's like refereeing a dispute between my tween daughters.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in more serious news, this week marked another milestone in America's battle with the coronavirus. The death toll passed 660,000, but that means now that 1 in 500 Americans have died of COVID-19. That news came in the middle of a heated scientific debate over whether the Biden administration should be pushing ahead with plans to provide Americans with a third dose of a vaccine, 8 months after their second dose. The White House is pointing to a study showing that people who received a third shot of the Pfizer vaccine in Israel were far less likely to develop severe COVID than those who had just received 2 injections. But an article by a group including, importantly, 2 of the top vaccine scientists at the Food and Drug Administration that was published in the Lancet Medical Journal this week warned careful and public scrutiny of the evolving data will be needed to ensure that decisions about boosting are informed by reliable science more than by politics. The authors argued, even if boosting were eventually shown to decrease the medium-term risk of serious disease, current vaccine supplies could save more lives if used in previously unvaccinated populations than if used as boosters in vaccinated populations. So in essence, They're saying the jury is out on whether a third dose is needed or not, now or ever. And if you put politics aside, you would do more good giving those doses to unvaccinated people, whether they're in America or somewhere else. And that puts them at odds with the leadership of the FDA, which has backed Biden's booster program. Dr. Philip Krause and Dr. Marion Gruber, who have both announced they're leaving the FDA, by the way, reportedly in part because they're upset at the Biden administration's announcement of that booster at 8 months program, neither of them think that there is really enough data at this point to justify offering booster shots, and they feel the announcement itself from Biden was a pressure campaign against the FDA to quickly authorise the booster shots. Now, the White House rejects that. They maintain they are simply following the advice of their top experts and that the booster program remains subject to independent regulatory approval, including from the Food and Drug Administration.
Almost a month ago, after weeks of discussion, 8 of the Department of Health and Human Services top doctors released a statement saying they had determined boosters would be needed and that we have a plan to begin a booster program starting the week of September 20th, subject to an independent evaluation from the FDA and ACIP. That continues to be the case.
Sounds like a mess. In the meantime, the push to get people vaccinated the first time continues. Now, last week we told you about Biden's new requirement that 80 million workers at private companies with more than 100 employees each will have to either get vaccinated or face regular COVID tests. Now, that requirement has tipped some people over the edge, like Republican Senate candidate in Ohio, Josh Mandel.
Joe Biden, I'm not even going to call him President Biden, he's not. Joe Biden is creating a constitutional crisis. I call on my fellow Americans, do not comply. Do not comply with the tyranny. And when the Gestapo show up at your front door, you know what to do.
I'm not sure the Gestapo offered free medicine.
Not the kind you want, no.
No, but Biden's critics made a more effective point, I thought, with this footage.
No, I don't think it should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand to be mandatory, but I would do everything in my power just to encourage people to do the right thing, and when they do it, demonstrate that it matters.
Got him! Also, back in 2012, Steve Breyer, the Supreme Court Justice, appeared to rule out conduct like this as even possibly being constitutional, saying if it turned out there was some terrible epidemic sweeping the United States, they could not require people to be inoculated. The federal government doesn't have that power. So that is the constitutional crisis that Josh Mandel was referring to before. Except, I'm not sure any of these arguments actually apply because this really isn't a vaccine mandate. You either need to get a vaccine or you can just get tested instead. You could equally consider this a testing regime that has an exemption for the vaccinated. Either way, this is the law that the government is currently relying on. It allows the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to set an emergency rule like this if employees are exposed to grave danger from exposure to substances or agents, and such an emergency standard is necessary to protect employees. So, is COVID a grave danger? Is it a substance or agent? And are vaccines and testing necessary to protect employees from the danger? Those are the questions the courts will have to answer. But in the meantime, there are other issues, like, for example, the body that's supposed to enforce this mandate with $13,000 fines per violation, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is manifestly under-resourced for this kind of task. They have 800 safety and compliance inspectors to cover over 100,000 private sector companies. So that's not going to work. Furthermore, people are obviously going to lie. American vaccine cards are printed on normal cardboard. They are incredibly easy to fake, and there are now whole communities on the Telegram app dedicated to distributing these fake cards. Some groups have 300,000 members, with the average cost of a fake card doubling to $200 after Biden's announcement last week. So then, what's the point of getting Josh Mandel all worked up in his cornfield if it's not going to work? Well, firstly, Biden's new mandate is popular. 58% of people favour it, according to Morning Consult, with even 33% of Republicans supporting it. Also, it doesn't have to work perfectly, it just needs to lead to more people getting vaccinated. In fact, many businesses would welcome this mandate as an excuse to push vaccinations without being blamed for it. That's why groups like the Business Roundtable said it welcomes the Biden administration's continued vigilance in the fight against COVID. America's business leaders know how critical vaccination and testing are in defeating the pandemic. Bottom line, John, is there are still 3.2 million workers who say they're not working because of COVID concerns. The sooner they get off the sidelines and people get out a bit more, the happier business are going to be. And that is what I think this is all about.
Yeah, you could be right. Well, for more, we're joined by Dr. Mark McLennan. He is a former FDA commissioner. He's also played a central role in managing America's pandemic response, with his focus being on accelerating vaccine and therapeutic drug development. Dr. McLennan, welcome to Planet America.
Good to be with you.
So what do you think of the situation your old agency finds itself in at the moment? Internal dissent, scientific debate over whether boosters should be taken, whether vaccines should be given to the under 12s as well, and accusations of political pressure as well?
Well, John, the FDA plays a critical role in any decision about the safety and effectiveness of medical products, and few decisions are higher profile than those involving the COVID vaccines. I think the reason that you're seeing what looks like some dissension in views is that this is a somewhat closer call. We know that the Pfizer vaccine, which is the one the FDA is reviewing now, this mRNA vaccine, is very safe and effective for people who are unvaccinated. The reason that this is a closer call is that there's some question about just how much more effective an additional dose will be. My reflections on the evidence that's been presented so far is that the vaccine looks like it meets the FDA's pre-written standards for approval of an additional booster dose from the standpoint of safety and from the standpoint of creating a stronger immune response. But because the vaccine itself is so effective, there's some questions about whether the additional dose is really going to be needed, especially for people who are at lower risk.
So as an administrator, when the data is not yet cut and dried or simply not yet in, how do you make a call at this point? Is it a flip of a coin?
It's way more than a flip of a coin, but it's not nearly as much as we'd ideally like to have. So earlier this year, John, the FDA laid out very clearly what it expected to see in terms of data submitted to support the authorization of a booster dose. And the company has technically met those standards. The challenge is that we'd like to know even more about, for example, whether certain populations, older individuals, people who had been vaccinated farther in the past, really do have a less substantial response to a viral infection, especially with the new Delta variant circulating. And what's a little bit unclear from the data is just how much additional protection the booster dose provides, especially for people who are younger and not high risk. Again, there's no evidence that from what we've seen so far that this dose is any less safe than the first two doses that people received. There is some good evidence that this booster will protect you more against mild infection or any infection at all. Just a question of whether it provides really substantial additional protection against severe infection because the vaccine itself is so effective to begin with.
Doctor, the Biden administration has been saying from day one, since before the election, in fact, that they would follow the science, that they wouldn't politicise the process of the vaccine rollout or therapeutics. Given that they're being accused of politicising it simply by announcing a deadline for boosters to be rolled out, do you think they are exerting political pressure, whether they admit it or not?
Yeah, there are two things you'd like to do at the same time. One thing is to be very thorough and complete and objective in evaluating all the evidence and making sure that all the boxes are checked for were the studies well done? Does it meet the FDA standards for safety and effectiveness? But number two, especially for a condition, a pandemic that's affecting so many people, to be able to act quickly when that evidence does exist, when those conclusions have been reached, to make the treatment available to everyone who could possibly benefit. And the administration, the Biden administration, is walking a line where they want to have broad availability to people who might benefit from the additional booster dose. We still have very high rates of COVID infections in many parts of the United States, and many people who have been vaccinated are having breakthrough infections, even though the vaccines are very effective. So those are two things that the administration that we'd like to see happen at the same time. And it can be a difficult balance to both be ready for rapid action when there is sufficient evidence, but also not to get ahead of judgments about that evidence. And you're going to see, I think, in the days ahead, some continued debates, discussion about who all should really get a booster dose based on the evidence that we're seeing so far.
Doctor, my final question is, and obviously we all hope that this pandemic is soon consigned to the history books. But if we are going to see, in fact, a repeated pattern of Delta-like variants, maybe even ones that are resistant to the current crop of vaccines, what do you think the major lessons of the last year and a half should be that are taken forward into that hypothetical future?
Well, one lesson, John, is that we are all in this together, and the more that countries can share data, share experience, the more prepared we will all be against any new variant or any new virus threat that emerges in the future. It's very clear that a virus threat that emerges anywhere can spread rapidly, no matter how hard we try. I know you've tried really hard in Australia. Can spread rapidly to most, if not all, of the rest of the world. And then the more people get infected, the more chances there are for that virus to get even tougher to combat. And that's what we're seeing now. Even though we've got higher rates of vaccination in many parts of the world, we're seeing still opportunities for variants to emerge. Looking ahead, we know that if we work together and plan ahead, we can identify the virus that causes a new infection, can identify new variants quickly. We can manufacture vaccines that work against those variants and treatments like monoclonal antibodies that work as well. But it is going to require the U.S. working together because, again, we're all in it together with the ease with which viruses can spread around the world today.
Dr. Mark McLennan, we appreciate your expertise. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Before we leave COVID, though, the numbers, I have not forgotten them. Daily cases are still hovering around the 150,000 a day mark. Hospitalisations appear to be falling, but deaths, which are a trailing indicator, continue to rise, now averaging about 1,800 a day. And if New South Wales was an American state, we would not be the 51st state for daily cases anymore. New South Wales is just edging out Connecticut this week. We'd be the second safest state in America. Oh, and by the way, look at California there at number 48. That might have played a role in the California recall result. That's to come later on. By the way, I know hospitalisations are down, but America still has a problem. The red zones are the hospital service areas where the ICUs are more than 95% full. That's a lot of areas, and that's why we're still seeing stories about a guy dying of a heart attack because he had to sit around for hours while a hospital tried to contact 43 other hospitals in 3 states in the hope one of them could fit him in. They couldn't fit him in, so the morgue fit him in instead. And that takes us to vaccines. Sadly, after 2 months of falling vaccination numbers and then 2 months of rising vaccine numbers, they seem to have begun falling again, which America does not need. If we look at the million-dose plus countries that are the most fully vaccinated in the world, Portugal's number 1 with 80% of their population fully vaccinated, but America is down to number 36, even though they got a huge head start on everyone else. And if we look at our usual table where Australian and American states are combined, New South Wales is now at number 21 for their share of the population that is at least partly vaccinated. Tasmania and Victoria are in the 30s, and the other 3 states have all now passed poor old Idaho as well. As far as the fully vaccinated share goes, Tasmania has begun passing US states now, and New South Wales is just behind Idaho by less than 0.5%. That will presumably be changing this week. John?
Now, Chaz, this week Senate Democrats unveiled a new voting rights bill and a plan to bring it forward for a vote as early as next week. The Freedom to Vote Act would make Election Day a public holiday, ensure that every state offers same-day voter registration, set minimum federal standards on mail-in voting and ban partisan gerrymandering. It's co-sponsored by moderate Democrat Joe Manchin, who, true to form, is out there trying to find 10 Republicans to support the bill and overcome a filibuster. Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer praised him for that attempt at bipartisanship.
This is a good proposal, one that nobody in this chamber should oppose. My colleague, Senator Manchin, is working with Republicans to secure support for the bill, and we look forward to hearing what changes they might make on legislation. I applaud Senator Manchin for his work here.
He doesn't really think that. Of course, Chuck knows that this is probably a forlorn effort on Joe Manchin's part. No Republicans are seriously considering supporting any of the earlier voting rights bills for the simple reason they assume it'd be just handing more votes to Democrats. So the perennial question now is, if there is no way to overcome a filibuster, will Joe Manchin let this voting bill die like all the rest, or will he finally support a carve-out to alter the filibuster, if not remove it altogether? We will see. Yeah, it's time for us to have a fireside chat, Chaz. And the big news out of California this week was that Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom comfortably survived that recall election. Polls earlier in the campaign showed that he was in grave danger of being dismissed under this wonky old recall system and replaced by Republican radio shock jock Larry Elder. Well, in the end, Big Gav survived the first recall vote, winning well over 60% on that ballot. And that meant that the tally on the second question that was on the ballot, who should replace him, was moot. Elder won that easily enough, though, with around 47% of the vote, ahead of Democrat Kevin Paffrath on under 10 points, and then came a whole bunch of others back there in 13th place. Reality TV star and former Olympian Caitlyn Jenner with just 1% of the vote, proving perhaps that name recognition alone is not enough to win in American politics, at least not if you are a transgender Republican who left the country to be on Australian TV during the campaign. But Chaz, Gavin Newsom's victory did not come cheaply. He spent around $70 million to prevent being recalled from the governorship. He enlisted the support of top Democrats, including Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, all helped him out. The price tag for the poor taxpayers in the state of California, a cool $276 million. For a result that wasn't even close. In a state that usually goes for Democrats by 20 to 30 points, it was a colossal waste of money all round, Chad.
Like, it really was. The idea of a recall election sounds democratic, absolutely, and it sounds great, but in reality, it just leads to activists constantly trying to recall.
Who are cashing in on it. They're getting that money. Those consultants, those people that put the petitions around, made off like bandits.
Absolutely. Well, it's not just those people, though. I mean, everyone's getting on the recall action. During the first 5 months of this year alone, at least 68 local Californian officials were targeted with recall campaigns. It's just ridiculous. Although, I will say this, there was one positive from my point of view, in terms of outcomes, during Larry Elder's concession speech.
As you know, my opponent, Governor Gavin Newsom, come on, let's be gracious. Let's be gracious in defeat. And by the way, we may have lost the battle, but we are going to win the war.
Did you hear that? He actually conceded.
What a loser.
He conceded. Like, it was a far cry from where it sounded like he was going a few days earlier.
Again, whether or not you win or lose, will you accept the results of the election tomorrow?
I think we all ought to be looking at election integrity, no matter whether you're a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican. Let's all make sure that the election is a fair election. So let's all work together, no matter what the results are, to make sure that the results are valid and legitimate, and everybody who voted should have voted. Let's all do that together.
Is that a commitment to accept the results of the election tomorrow?
Let's all do that together. Let's all work together on both sides of the aisle to make sure that the election is a fair election.
Very subtle. And then the day before the election, Elder publicised an online form that claimed it had detected fraud in the results of the recall election, resulting in Governor Gavin Newsom being reinstated as governor. That was, of course, before the election had even happened.
Whoops.
And no results had been released. So it's hard to see how those results could have already proven fraud. Anyway, whether Larry Elder decided to show some dignity or whether the margin was too big to cry fraud or whether he just got sick of the whole charade, he is not a loser. He is a modern hero because it was extremely welcome to see a Republican just concede defeat in traditional fashion without lawsuits, without audits, and without conspiracy theories. Oh, and there's one more thing. It might be nothing. Exit polls are often inaccurate, but they did show that compared to 2020, there was a 30-point swing to Republicans amongst Hispanic voters. Now, don't want to make too big deal out of that, but that is a trend that Democrats have been watching with some trepidation for the last 5-6 years.
Yep, sure is.
And now they might just have a teensy bit more trepidation. You know, what's your takeaway from the election?
Well, Elder being gracious, and welcome, you're absolutely right. He's also the front runner now if he wants to run against Newsom in next year's regular gubernatorial election. He's now the Republican front runner to be, he'll have to go through a primary, but you'd say he's head and shoulders above the rest. I mean, he's anyone above 10%. So there's that. Newsom did make this, he effectively put Donald Trump on the ballot, and so people weren't thinking Larry Elder, they were thinking Donald Trump. All of Newsom's ads were Elder with Trump, Elder with Trump, Elder is Trump, Elder is Trump, Trump is Elder, Trump is Elder, Trump is running against Newsom, get rid of him. So he did that very effectively. He nationalised it with Biden, Harris, Sanders and Warren. Now Democrats are saying, well, this is great because it unified the Democratic Party, the left and the right wing coming out to support Gavin Newsom, and this is a terrific thing, and it's a repudiation of Donald Trump. Look, all it tells us really is that if Donald Trump were to run in California, he would lose by 20 or 30 points, which is what he did last time and the time before that when he was on the ballot in California. I don't think this is really about Trump at all, although you could argue maybe once again, Trumpy candidates don't do that well if Trump himself is not also on the ballot, which is the case with someone like Ron DeSantis.
I reckon COVID also played a role. Like I said before, California's doing very well with COVID at the moment. They talked a lot about COVID during the campaign. Yeah. Anyway, we are running out of time. So if we just have time, I'd love to just squeeze in a quick nerdy point.
Yes, go right ahead.
A lot of people have been hanging on the monthly inflation results recently because
it's out of control.
Yeah, inflation numbers, they've been over 5%, right? Now this month, inflation was again 5.3%. But firstly, that's all inflation, including a few random products that don't really matter. If you look at core inflation, the number is a little lower. Also, this is compared to 12 months ago when we were in the middle of a pandemic shutdown. So of course prices have jumped since then. This is the interesting bit. If you compare to 24 months ago instead, you see the inflation numbers are much lower. And once again, the core inflation from 24 months ago was lower still. So it can be misleading, the 12-month figure. Also, that gives you more context, but the best way to adjust for the pandemic is look at the month-to-month figures rather than year-to-year figures. If we look at how the CPI has grown from month to month and then multiply those numbers by 12 for a whole year, you can see those numbers are on their way down over the last couple of months. In other words, inflation is worth keeping an eye on for sure, but don't think it's as much of a problem as some are making out.
Yes, we'll see what happens if they put $3.5 trillion into the economy in the next couple of months. Before we go though, time for some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And this week, Donald Trump did not join Presidents Biden, Obama and Clinton at the 9/11 memorial at the World Trade Center in New York, nor did he join former President George W. Bush at the Flight 93 memorial in Pennsylvania, which is probably just as well because Trump wouldn't have appreciated this.
Malign force seems at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument and every argument into a clash of cultures. So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. That leaves us worried about our nation and our future together.
It certainly felt like a repudiation of Donald Trump, and Bush invoked the spirit of unity felt by many Americans 20 years ago after 9/11. Meanwhile, Trump himself, he was visiting with police in New York, where he observed...
It's a sad day. It's a very sad day for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, a real lot of reasons, like 3,000 Americans killed 20 years ago, including more than 300 New York police, first responders, fire brigade, Port Authority people who ran into those burning buildings. But Instead of talking about them, Trump complained that nobody was talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which he called
very disappointing.
And then literally within 10 seconds, he was talking about the 2020 election. Literally 10 seconds after that, still nothing about the victims of 9/11. He was taking questions.
You know what I thought I'd do? You've heard so many words, all you hear is words. And they become meaningless after a while when you hear some of these politicians talking. But if you have any questions, please, I'll give you a little chance. You could be a star.
And the first question was about whether Trump was running again in 2024. He said he couldn't say because of campaign finance regulations, but
I think you're going to be happy. Let me put it that way, okay? I think you're going to be very happy.
And then after about another 10 minutes of talking about how police all support Trump, nothing about those who died on 9/11, he went for a walk. He posed for a lot of smiling selfies. He looked every bit the presidential candidate. Still not talking about 9/11, instead complaining about how many Humvees Joe Biden left behind in Afghanistan.
$85 billion worth of equipment we left behind. You couldn't fly the airplanes out?
Okay. Now, that claim proved to be false. According to the fact checkers at Snopes, the US did spend over $80 billion training and equipping the Afghan military, but there are no official figures on how much equipment was left. Experts estimate, though, it was maybe around $10 billion. So that there is malarkey from Donald Trump. But honestly, Chaz, the biggest pile of malarkey for me was the fact that Trump did not say anything on all of that wandering around New York on 9/11 about the lives lost, not on 9/11, not in Afghanistan or anywhere else. He didn't bother to go to the 9/11 memorial with the other former presidents, a huge break in protocol. So how did he spend the rest of this solemn day of commemoration? Well, he did post a video supporting the religious cult, the Moonies.
In a few decades, the inspiration that they've caused for the entire planet is unbelievable. And I congratulate you again and again.
And he saw out 9/11 as a guest commentator on a pay-per-view boxing match promoted by his son, featuring 58-year-old pug Evander Holyfield.
This has been an incredible success. I hear it's going crazy over the internet, going absolutely crazy. And I don't know, how about, we'll set up a fight. How about you against this guy over here? I don't know, this guy over here is pretty big. This one, I think Junior's a little bit on the large side.
Okay, which is all very, very bizarre to me, Chaz, because, when people look at what a president should behave like, particularly when it comes to the military, let's not forget this.
A lot of veterans and active military members are criticizing the commander-in-chief for having a coffee cup in his saluting hand as he greets the military personnel at the end of those steps.
That was very offensive.
Yeah,
Still angry.
I'm still angry too.
Still angry. Look, I'm not going to pretend that that boxing commentary stint wasn't extremely strange. It definitely was. But to be fair to Trump, he did put out two other statements on 9/11. He started the day with this one here.
September 11th represents great sorrow for our country. Many things were displayed that day, including, most importantly, the bravery of our police, fire, and first responders of every kind. The job they did was truly unbelievable. We love them and we thank them.
Now, yes, that did soon turn into yet another attack on Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, but then he also put out this statement for the National Day of Prayer.
We honor the memory of every innocent soul killed in the September 11th attacks. We cherish their legacy and we reaffirm our everlasting vow to never forget.
And that was actually a genuinely nice statement, honestly. It went for over 7 minutes.
Which he genuinely did not write.
Probably not.
Which he was genuinely trying to avoid the fallout from the fact that he was commentating a boxing match.
Sure, but all I'm saying is he put that out on the day before there was a controversy about the boxing match. It went for over 7 minutes. It was almost exclusively about the victims and heroes of 9/11. But I'm not surprised that you don't know about that one because it got literally zero media coverage. The media was obsessed with boxing matches and Moonies and all that kind of stuff. And it leads to the age-old conundrum for me with Trump, which is, of course, you're going to comment when Trump does something weird and inappropriate. It makes perfect sense. But if Trump gets zero attention when he does something normal and appropriate, like that video, and he gets wall-to-wall coverage when he does something bizarre and unbecoming, what do you think he's going to do more of? We know how Trump works, right? And it's a problem I think the media still hasn't come to terms with after 6 years, and I'm not sure we're ever going to come to terms with it.
I think you're being way, way too generous. The fact that he would not share the stage with Biden, Obama, Clinton or Bush, that he would not change his schedule to not go to a boxing bout or post a Mooney video, for goodness sake. And the fact that he did not, it's fine to have scripted videos, but the fact that he did not, at any point when he's out campaigning for the presidency on 9/11, actually talk about the 3,000 dead men and women. Yeah, he paid a bit of a tribute to the police in that video, but not when he was out there, not when it was him talking, not off an auto cue. I don't think the problem's with the media, I think the problem's with Trump.
Yeah, I think it's a problem with both.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll just agree to disagree on that one, Chaz. But that's it for another trip to Planet America. You can find extended interviews on iView, YouTube, Facebook, anytime you like.
And you'll find the New Pet podcast in all the usual pod places. R.I.P. Norm Macdonald, comedy legend. Bye-bye.